Let us begin not with a bang, but with the curious silence that fell upon Sweden on the 1st of September, 1939. A silence laced with the tension of cannons sounding in the distance and Europe erupting into flames. As Hitler's armies goose-stepped into Poland and Britain and France issued their declarations, Sweden, flanked by Finland, Norway and Denmark, all soon to face invasion or war, stood very still and said, in effect, "Not us." This was not cowardice, but choreography. What unfolded over the next 6 years was not an idle neutrality, but a delicate, feverishly choreographed dance. A ballet of pragmatism, laced with moral compromise, humanitarian courage, economic entanglement, and just a pinch of good fortune. Sweden's tale during the Second World War is not that of a country untouched by violence, nor of one lost in moral purity. It is, instead, the tale of a nation threading a needle while the room burned. Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson's statement to the Riksdag on 1st September 1939 was precise, almost surgical. Sweden would remain neutral. That, in itself, was not extraordinary. Sweden had not fought in a war since 1814, and its geopolitical instincts were deeply pacifist. What was extraordinary was the geography. Nestled between Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the vulnerable Nordic trio. A nation of just over 6 million people at the time, Sweden immediately began mobilizing. Within days, nearly 850,000 Swedes were under arms, a staggering figure amounting to more than 12% of the entire population. Bunkers were built, trenches dug, anti-aircraft units stationed on rocky hills and quiet islands. If neutrality was to be claimed, it had to be backed by teeth. And so began the balancing act. They were neutral, yes, no war was declared, but the act of preparing for the worst, of fortifying a nation and arming its people, was no less intense than war itself. The silence was not peace. It was readiness cloaked in restraint. Sweden's greatest gift and curse was its iron. The high-grade ore mined in northern Sweden was a key component in German weaponry. Sweden exported some 10 million tons of the stuff to Germany annually during the early war years. This was not done with any joy. But with Nazi forces occupying Denmark and Norway, refusing would have meant becoming the next link in the chain. So, the trains rolled. The ports in Luleå and Narvik bustled, and Stockholm, in closed chambers, sighed. Then came the permittent traffic. In 1940, and again after Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Sweden permitted German troops on leave to pass through its rail system. This was not technically military movement, but everyone knew what it was. Trains filled with weary Wehrmacht soldiers rumbled across Swedish soil. The neutrality, at this point, had developed cracks. And yet, behind closed doors, a very different music played. Sweden quietly shared intelligence with the Allies. British aircraft crews who crash-landed on Swedish territory were interned, yes, but under fairly generous conditions, and with occasional accidental escapes. Norwegian resistance fighters were trained in Sweden. Diplomats played a double game, hosting both Axis and Allied envoys with stoic smiles. It was a chess game in a sandstorm. June 1941. The sun barely set over Stockholm. Germany launched its vast invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, and demanded that Sweden allow the fully armed 163rd Infantry Division to cross from Norway into Finland via Swedish rails. This was the moment. Would Sweden's neutrality shatter? Prime Minister Hansson, a cautious and reasonable man, was shaken. Diaries and testimonies reveal his inner torment. One evening, he even suggested to colleagues that he might resign rather than concede. But in the end, he did concede. The trains crossed. Neutrality, if not dead, was clearly breathless. And yet to many Swedes, this was not betrayal. It was survival. A sacrifice of principle to avoid total invasion. It bought time. And Sweden used that time well. If Sweden's economy danced with Germany, its soul often looked elsewhere. As the Nazis grew more monstrous, the Swedish heart opened. When Denmark's Jews were threatened in 1943, Sweden opened its doors. Some 8,000 Danes, mostly Jewish, were ferried across the Öresund Strait in small boats, welcomed not by suspicion, but sanctuary. Earlier, in the Winter War of 1939–40, 8,000 Swedish volunteers had rushed to aid Finland against Soviet aggression. Swedish Red Cross workers crisscrossed Europe. Swedish hospitals took in thousands of wounded Norwegians. Swedish diplomats negotiated protections for Polish officers and Norwegian prisoners. And of course, there was Raoul Wallenberg. Sent to Budapest in 1944, this unassuming young diplomat, armed with a Swedish passport and unrelenting courage, issued thousands of protective documents to Hungarian Jews and saved tens of thousands from the Holocaust. He vanished in 1945, likely into a Soviet prison, but his shadow remained as tall as any army. Despite all this cautious diplomacy, Sweden was not left completely untouched. Allied and Axis aircraft occasionally violated its airspace. In Malmö, Lund, and a few northern outposts bombs fell, mostly by accident, though always with deep alarm. Anti-aircraft units lit up the skies. Civilians scrambled to shelters. In 1943, a British bombing raid over Copenhagen missed its mark and slammed into Lund. No one died, but the Swedish press howled. The war, it seemed, cared little for carefully worded neutrality. Meanwhile, German spies skulked through Stockholm cafes. British agents slipped notes through diplomatic pouches. The Swedish capital became a curious salon of espionage and diplomacy. Mata Hari in snow boots. Sweden's economy benefited from the war. The ore shipments, timber sales, and shipping routes generated serious income. Industry thrived. But the moral ledger is trickier to tally. Sweden permitted German intelligence networks to operate. It censored its own press, lest it anger Berlin. Its arms industry sold to both sides. Neutrality meant keeping your options open, but also sometimes your conscience closed. Winston Churchill, never one to mince words, accused Sweden of turning a blind eye. Others, particularly in occupied Norway and Denmark, resented the Scandinavian siblings' apparent passivity. And yet, could they have done otherwise? As the Third Reich began its collapse, Sweden began to lean openly toward the Allies. In 1944, de endlich stängte Permittentrafik. In 1945, it allowed Allied air operations to use its territory to repatriate prisoners. Swedish banks quietly unfroze assets. German sympathizers vanished from view. Post-war trials never quite came. But debates flared in the years that followed. Was this neutrality, this Scandinavian somnambulism, something noble or something craven? The answer, of course, lies not at the poles of virtue or vice, but somewhere in between. Sweden's neutrality was not passive. It was not cowardice. It was a high-wire act performed in gale force winds. It made deals, saved lives, stained its hands, and opened its arms. Sweden during the Second World War was not a statue in a park. It was a mirror, reflecting the complexities of human decision-making under pressure. And it was a messenger, quietly aiding resistance, protecting lives, and playing host to the refugees and stories the world was busy burning. If courage is measured only in rifles fired, Sweden fired none. But if it is measured in lives saved, hands extended and danger endured with a trembling smile, then she stood among the bravest,